it's very, very interesting. And so that's one deal.
Right on. At least you still have that, that space to do what you love to do. So that's what it's all about.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. No, I had office hours this morning for an hour. It's really been fascinating. It's very, very interesting. And I'm hearing myself.
All right. So because I got us on YouTube, so we are officially live.
Oh, we need to look.
And I want to turn it over to Charlie to welcome the series.
Welcome back, everyone, for another exciting episode of the Indigenous Virtual Speaker Series. I hope you all enjoyed yesterday's talk. I know I did. Behind the scenes, it's very interesting. Today we have another special guest, and I hope that everyone is enjoying their day the best that they can. I know it's pretty fair weather here, so I'm enjoying it. And I'll turn it over to my partner in crime, Virgil Moorhead Jr.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. I'm really excited about our guest today. We have the extraordinary community organizer, educator, Dr. Marshall Ganz. Dr. Ganz is one of the nation's most well-known organizers. In the early 60s, Dr. Ganz dropped out of Harvard to join the civil rights movement in Mississippi. He later spent 16 years working with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers before returning to Harvard to finish his BA and earn a PhD in sociology. Of interest, during the 2008 presidential campaign, he helped architect Barack Obama's organizing operations strategy. He teaches at the Harvard Kennedy School in Leadership, Organizing, and Civil Society. Welcome, Dr. Ganz.
Thank you, Virgil. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you. I look forward to this.
And so we'll get started right with an opening question. And so, here at Two Feathers, we are a nonprofit. We primarily work with Native American youth and families. And we do a lot of counseling, a lot of cultural programming, and trying to prevent as well as, change some of the intergenerational cycles of struggles that some Native American communities face. And so my first question to you is, from an organizing perspective, from your work, where would we start? What would you recommend us to start to look at as top priorities to really have an impact at a community level here in Humboldt County?
Oh boy, that's a big question. And of course, I'm no expert on Humboldt County or on the community. So it's sort of coming at it from a different perspective. Maybe the best way for me to respond to that is to say a little bit about organizing and kind of how I think about that, and then move from that to this, to a more specific approach to the question. The approach that I think of organizing as a form of leadership. In other words, of how, and the understanding of leadership that I use is rooted in three questions posed by a first century Jerusalem scholar, Rabbi Hillel. He was asked, how do I figure out what to do with my life? And he responded with three questions to ask yourself. And the first one, ask yourself, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Now, it's not meant to be selfish. It's meant to be self-regarding. It's a challenge to self-awareness that if you presume to engage with others, you better be clear about what you bring to it and what you expect from it. But the second question he says to ask is, if I am for myself alone, what am I? Because to be a who, a human being, and not a what, a thing, is to understand that we exist in relationship with others in the world. We are inherently relational beings. And finally, he says, ask yourself, if not now, when? It's not advice to jump into moving traffic, but it is a caution against just plan for another year. We'll have the perfect plan, then we'll launch it. The world will totally conform to our plan, except it never does. It's the idea is that rarely can we learn to do well what we want to do until we actually begin to do it. And so for me, leadership's about the interaction between the self, oneself, others, and action, and how they come together. And the fact that that they're questions is also important, because if you think about when we need leadership, when we need to organize, when we need leadership, I don't know, have you had the experience when things are going well in your organization that people say, where's the leadership so we can thank them? When do people say who's in charge? Yeah, when do they say who's in charge here? Yeah, when do they say, hey, where's it? It's usually when there's problems. I mean, and it's the problems, the contradictions, the dilemmas, the challenges. That's really what leadership's about. When everything's going really well, what do you need leadership for? Your system's working. And so that's kind of challenging to say, okay, whoa, that means that I'm going to constantly be challenged. Do I have the skills that I need to deal with these new challenges? And that's a challenge to the hands. Can I use my resources in new ways to accomplish my purpose? And that's a challenge to the head. It's a strategic challenge. And then there's, where do I get the hope? Where do I get the courage? How do I inspire the hope and courage and solidarity in others that it takes to take the risks that are involved in really dealing with challenges in a real way? And that's a challenge to the heart. So it's a way of thinking of leadership and organizing in a head, hands, heart kind of way, not just one of those, but all three and how they interact. So the definition that I've come to use for leadership is that it's about accepting responsibility as a choice for enabling others to achieve shared purpose under conditions of uncertainty. So this is not leader as, you know, the sun in the sky that gives us all light. It's not that at all. It's a form of engagement with others around the accomplishment of shared purpose. It's not so much doing what I want as it is enabling people to do what they want. And that's a different kind of way of thinking about it. Now, organizing for me then is a form of that, where the first question that we ask is, who are my people? Who is the community with whom I'm engaging in this relationship? So it's not like, who am I performing for? It's who am I in relationship with? And then from their from their lived experience, what is the change they need and want? You know, not because I did a study somewhere and I think this is what they need, but, you know, what is their understanding of what they need and what change they can imagine? And then the last question is not, it's how can I work with them to enable them to turn their resources into the power that they need to accomplish what they want. Mm-hmm. And so it's a way of thinking of leadership and organizing, not as like marketing a product to customers, not like providing services to clients. It's much more about engaging people with each other, bringing them together to form what we call a constituency. And constituency comes from Latin constare, which means to stand together. So it's about bringing people together to learn together, decide together, stand together, act together, and hopefully win together. So that's just kind of a way of framing. And foundational to that, we teach 5 skills. One is relationship building, the second is storytelling, the third is strategizing, the fourth is structuring, the fifth is acting. And these are all things that we actually know how to do. So a lot of the work we do is how to take what we understand implicitly, make it explicit, so we can bring craft and intentionality and skill to it. So to go back to your question, those are the questions I would ask is, okay, so, you know, I'd spend a lot of time having one-on-one meetings. I spend a lot of time understanding the relationships, understanding where the challenges are, understanding where the hopes are, and understanding where the leadership may be and where the resources may be. And by resources, I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about skill, about commitment, about solidarity, about what one scholar calls moral resources, not just material resources, because those are critically important. If you're David trying to deal with Goliath, you have to be more resourceful. You have to be smarter and more committed than Goliath.
Thank you for that. And so One of the things that I know you've said, at least what you just said, and also in some of your work is like, the big lessons in like social movements and organizing is about, narratives and relationships, and also about leadership development. And so for myself, like, I grew up on the Big Lagoon Rancheria and struggled with my own substance abuse, drugs and alcohol. And much of my family has also struggled and continue to struggle some. And my sister and I were the first to graduate college, and I was the first to get a doctorate degree. And so the reason and I was before here, I was at Stanford as a staff psychologist, but I had the calling to come back, to my own community.
Yeah.
And that often is that experience is what drives me, right? And so I say that because I wonder, like, how in your experience are you able to get people inspired, people that maybe don't have the personal experience, to buy in to the larger picture of changing the status quo? Like, how is it to how do you identify those leaders, or how do you go about that in your experience?
Boy, these are tough questions, because they're tough questions because they're questions you answer in the doing of them. But let me try this. Tell me again where you grew up, Virgil.
I grew up in Humboldt County on the Big Lagoon Rancheria, which is close to Trinidad, California.
And your folks did what?
My father is the chairman of our tribe,
Oh,
and has been my whole life. And my mother was a teacher's aide and the janitor at our school, but she's retired. And yeah,
and you went to school where?
I went to college at UC Davis.
Oh no, I mean elementary.
Oh, I went to the school right next to the Rancheria, which is called Big Lagoon Elementary.
Yeah.
There was only about 60 students from kindergarten to 8th grade, and I went to the Big Lagoon from kindergarten to 8th grade.
And was everyone from the Native American community?
No, just pretty much my family and some others. There was probably, I would say, of the 60, about a quarter were Native, or maybe half, a quarter.
So yeah, so how was that, going to an elementary school that was like 3/4 not?
I think, well, I was I mean, I would have to answer that by reflecting back on it. And I think that it was good in the sense of, like, I didn't really see until I was older, like, the difference between, native and non-native, brown and white. I didn't really experience until I got to high school, like racism and other So
what happened?
yeah.
So what happened in high school?
High school, I went to McKinleyville High, which, I experienced the prejudice, the racism,
How?
well,
When?
I think
No.
from teachers, from my peers making comments of
Like for example.
like, for example, like when I got into the university, they said I only got into the university because I was Native.
Yeah. What about even before that, when you just got there?
Yes, I think, there was comments like, prairie with the N. I don't want to use the word. Other comments of.
Can you tell us of a specific incident that you remember? With a teacher or with other students?
Yes, I do. I had a girlfriend at the time, and one of the teachers, the girlfriend told me, said, "Why are you dating him?" But I was like college prep and doing good in school. So I remember thinking, like, well, what's up with that teacher? What's wrong with me?
And what happened then?
Well, what happened is it made me develop a chip on my shoulder.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to show you, we'll see, how I end up.
Yeah. And how did the chip play out in high school?
Hard work, discipline. I wrestled. And so I wrestled all year round and ended up wrestling at UC Davis, which is Division I. And so I turned that, I think, doubt and that the sort of racism into, I think, hard work and discipline.
Where do you think you got where did you get the strength to do that? I mean,
Yeah.
because you're coming into a lot of, sounds like a lot of painful stuff.
I think my father and my family, I
How
think,
so? In what-
well, they were just always there for me. My father ended up being the high school coach. He always
Oh,
supported, and I think he experienced similar experiences that
Okay.
I experienced, probably even more intense. So I think having that, and also, I only hung out with the other Native kids were my friends for the
Yeah.
most part. And so I think having that peer support, as well as my father and my mother, was consistent.
Yeah, no, moms are consistent, which is a real important thing about moms, I think. And do you remember a particular moment with your father, your mother, where things were tough and they were there for you?
Well, I think where my mind goes is wrestling, and when I would lose and be ready to give up, like, I think my dad would be like, we don't quit.
Yeah,
We continue. And I think that's like the story of kind of my life, is you don't quit. So I think, in the wrestling rooms, and just when wanting to give up and not quitting.
those are important moments, aren't they?
Yeah.
The person who's there for you in those moments matters a whole lot.
Hmm.
So then you went on to college,
Yeah.
and what was that?
At college, I think because of wrestling and the friendships that I developed, again, helped me stay there. I think right when I got into freshman year, my girlfriend broke up with me because I went to college and she
Oh,
was she was younger. And
yeah,
so that was really hard. But I had that, like, it wasn't an option to come home. Like it wasn't, even though as hard as it was,
yeah.
it wasn't in an option. I think that was developed from that. Like, when I say that I'm going to do something, I'm going to finish it.
Yeah, well, you wrestle stuff to the mat, right? I mean, you don't let go, do you?
Yeah.
Yeah, no. And so college was, what was 4 years?
5 years. I redshirted. So because I wrestled all 5 years, so I extended it out to 5 years.
And what were you studying?
I studied communication. I got a double major in communication and sociology with the emphasis in social services.
Why did you pick social services?
I think that I was learning about criminology and learning about the history of the criminal justice system. And I took one class and it really interested me. And then I started getting interested in myself and understanding the relationship difficulties I've had, throughout my life, and trying to figure out, like, how can I be a better person? So I think that sociology with emphasis in social services made me start to self-reflect, and I liked it.
How did your parents feel about what you were studying?
Initially, my dad always thought that I should go into business.
Right.
So he was a little surprised because the sociology, social services led to the counseling, right? The psychology. And so
Yeah,
I think that initially he was really surprised.
yeah. And did he stay surprised?
He stayed surprised for a while, but I think in the long run, he came to accept it and sees the benefit, because within our own community, our own tribe, there's the importance of sustainability within economically and tribal sovereignty, but also our own health and wellness.
Yeah, I hope he recognized at some point where you got those kinds of values in the first place, which I suspect had a lot to do with what your family was doing as well. So after college, what?
After college, that's when I was really, like, wrestling stopped and I really struggled, for about 4 years
Hmm,
with alcohol and got into some, like, of the pills and drugs. And so I was really lost, I think. But then I decided to go back to school and get my master's. And that was, when I got into counseling and got sober. I'm sober for 13 years.
that's right.
And, I think graduate school really helped me to kind of find myself and help me get back on track. But I was lost,
How did you find yourself? What happened?
I think, again, my father, because he's sober too, he's sober
Uh,
like 32 years, one of the first ones of all his brothers and stuff. I think his continued support. I think, I had some really good friends that stuck by me and really believed in me. But I always had this belief that I would make it on the other end, even in my like deep struggles with alcohol. I
Yeah.
always knew that I would eventually be sober. And I think graduate school and if I'm really honest, the fear of failure, and I knew that I couldn't manage it anymore. I couldn't drink without, really, as I was already kind of a failure because I was drinking and,
Yeah.
not being with high integrity. But I think that something clicked one night and I'm like, I'm going to do this. And I sort of used that will, but I also put myself around the right people and changed some things, such as changing my phone number and stuff like that, to really be committed to my sobriety.
So it takes a lot of courage. It takes, I think, also a lot of love, I think, to find your way through that, from others. So then you finished grad school,
Mm-hmm.
and then?
And then, I went to Michigan to do my training and was out there for a year, University of Michigan. And I came back, did my postdoc at Stanford and started working and living in Palo Alto and, living a mile from campus. And, I always felt like, I don't know I wanted to learn. Like Stanford was just awesome to learn, but I knew that it wasn't the right fit in the sense of, I think I've always been for the underdog. And so there was a disconnect, and it almost led me to leave the field of psychology and mental health because I was like, I don't see the use. And so that's when I started to think about, all right, I'm going to move back home,
Yeah.
and ultimately ended up, moving back home.
So you started by asking me this question, but I've been asking you the questions.
Yes, you switched it on me.
Well, but because I think you have a lot to teach. And I mean, I think that just the brief story you shared with us, there's a lot of lessons in that about what matters, about where to find courage, about honoring your own calling, and I think so in a way, I kind of feel like you answered the question that you asked me. That wasn't just me trying to avoid.
No, that makes sense.
No, but really, I also really appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation and to get to know you better, Virgil.
Mm-hmm.
But see, I think, it's kind of like life gives us wounds, but people learn from sharing the scars, because if you don't have scars, what do you have to teach? Because where you been? But if you stay in your wounds, you're stuck. And so that way to move from wounds to scars, there's so much teaching to be done from that, I think. Real teaching, So, yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah. So kind of what I'm taking, is trusting, my own voice and own story and in that suffering and teaching more from that.
That's right.
Uh,
That's right. And in the community, there are other stories. There are many stories. And there are stories of resilience. There are stories of hope. There are stories of scars and how scars came about. And that's a source of wisdom and a source of teaching that crosses generations. It's why the first place we hear stories, our parents tell us these stories, because there's stories teach. They teach the heart. They're not just like, do this, don't do that, because in a story, we can identify with the person telling the story. And so we feel what's being told, not just in the head, but in the heart. And that's where the important lessons are, I think. That's where the lessons of courage and compassion and resilience, and that's where all that is. So through sharing stories of this kind, it's a way to not just inspire, it's actually a way, it's more than inspiring, it's actually moving people in a way to a deeper self-understanding. And that's what we call a story of self. But a story of us then is experiences shared by the community that when spoken, when shared, create a sense of shared values, of shared sources of hope, shared sources of courage. And that we call a story of us. And then comes the third one is the story of now, which is, okay, here we are. This is what we share. Now, what are the urgent challenges we face now? And where do we find our hope? And what are the choices we have to make in order to address those challenges in a hopeful, not a fearful way? And that's what we call a story of now. And, it's not something we invented. I think it's something maybe we discovered how to put into words, because in different parts of the world where I've had a chance to do this work, everybody they ask themselves these questions. They answer them in different ways. But those questions they're all over, I think. So there's just so much that can be done within the community itself, I think, with its own resources and its own heroes and its own leadership.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that I keep coming back to when you're speaking to the teachings, what your way of thinking is I, us, and now. That really resonates with me, coming from a ceremonial family, and how like our creation stories really teach us lessons, and that's something that's come from like our relationship with each other, but also the relationship with the natural world and the environment.
That's
And so
right.
that's something that relating it to now, it's like, well, right now it's a little bit off balance because we haven't really had access to manage for our resources or our health and wellness staples. And so, yeah, there's a little bit of a disbalance in our social realm. And so, like, how do we combat that? And it's like kind of getting back to those lessons. What can we take away? And that comes from like us as people. Like, well, what did we overcome to get here? Like, let's follow that same type of mindset and attitude. And I think that's something that will be extremely beneficial for some of the clinicians who work here at Two Feathers with us, because we got a pretty good balance of native mentors such as myself, and also like clinical psychiatrists who are able to use the Western medicine approach, but also with that wraparound effect from a cultural standpoint, to where not only are you healing a person individually, but you're also rekindling that cultural revitalization.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I kind of put in my own ideas from what you're kind of speaking to. So I really appreciate that. And I felt the need to say that just for our audience and how that relates to us here in Humboldt County, because we got a pretty heavy, dense population of Native peoples. And so it's really important, to really zero that into like a local perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. Thank you so much for that. I think that's spot on. And I think in a way, I think we've been talking a lot about the heart work, but there's also the question of power. There's the question of, okay, we share this, we want this, we have these moral resources, but how do we change the world out there in such a way that it works for the lives that we want to live? And that's where the power question comes in. And you don't exercise power as an individual. It's a communal project. I was always so inspired by the Montgomery bus boycott that started the modern civil rights movement, because people would ride those segregated buses, given their money to the bus company. But when they got the idea that they could all not ride those buses and walk to work and do it as a community and not as individuals, their dependency on the bus company turned into the bus company's dependency on the community. They turned an individual resource to collective power. And that's at the heart of what organizing is about, is how to do that, is how to engage people in sharing, bringing their time, their effort, their commitment to each other so that they can begin to build the power that you need. And power, it's one of those words that, sometimes people don't like to say. And I think it's because people who have a lot of it don't want us to talk about it, I actually think is how it works. But I think there's a pretty clear way to understand power. There are many ways, but one is if you need what I have more than I need what you have, who's got the power? If you need what I have more than I need what you have, who's got the power?
You.
Yeah, right. And we flip it around, who's got the power?
Me.
Yeah. See, because power is not a thing, it's a relationship. And it's a relationship between need or interest and resources. And if you think of it that way, then you begin to see, oh, how do we put things together? Sometimes people can enhance their power simply by collaborating, like a credit union or like a co-op of any kind. But when you need resources that somebody else has decision over or control over, then you got to figure out how to discover what their needs are and how you can use your resources to influence those needs. A classic example is politicians, right? I know I worked in the farmer crew community. They had the saying, al nopal no se viene a ver solo cuando tiene tuna, which means politicians only come to see the prickly pear cactus when it's bearing fruit. And it's like, yeah, people show up in the community just before the election. So, okay. But it reflects the fact that, okay, there's a vote, there's election. But it's not just that, it's things we buy. It's whom we honor, whom we respect. It's laws we follow or don't. And so in a deep level, any system of oppression requires a cooperation at some level. And there is always the option of withdrawing. This was Gandhi's great teaching, what Dr. King taught, what we learned in the farmer movement. It may be costly, but we have to see where the interdependencies are, because then that opens up ways we can act as a community, like in that boycott example, to assert our needs in such a way that others have to respond. And that's kind of the other piece of this. And that's also not an individual undertaking. That's something we do together. Does that make sense? Now that's kind of at an abstract level. You start thinking, well, what are the real challenges in the community? And where is the power? And how to influence that in such a way as to assert the needs of the community. Mm-hmm. That's where the organizing is. That's what that's about.
So I had a question to sort of bring it into the present moment right now. And I think you've mentioned maybe in one of the talks I watched about like digital and online organizing.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, like what your thoughts are around that, especially during these times, which so many of us are doing a lot of our work online.
Yeah, I have to say that I love it. Now, I was a skeptic. I was a total skeptic because I said, no, you can't teach interpersonal stuff online. Forget that. But about 7 years ago, I was convinced to try it. And I tried a class on organizing just in 3 different cities. And what blew me away was, oh, we could see people. See, I was thinking, oh, it's like social media or it's like digital. No, you could see people. When you can see people, that's very different because we can see emotion, we can see authenticity, we can see a whole lot when we see other people's faces. And so it sort of inspired me to try it. And so for 7 years now, I've been teaching an online organizing class. I mentioned earlier, I had office hours this morning. Yesterday we had class. We have 150 students, 140 students from 25 countries, different parts of the world. They're all doing organizing projects. We all meet together real time. And for the Australians, it's a little tough because it's like 1 a.m. for them. But then we meet in sections of 20. I have 7 teaching fellows work with, and everybody's working on an organizing project in their communities. And so the class is kind of a support for the work they're doing. And since the virus came along, it's been great because we've been able to learn with each other and figure out how to go do online what they were doing offline. So I became kind of a convert. And it's interesting, last fall, I was teaching a class online on public narratives, what we were just the self-us now. And I was also teaching a class at the Kennedy School. And there was a woman who was taking the class in Norway, and she came to the Kennedy School for a week for a conference, and she came to the class in person. And I said, well, what did you think? She said, you know, I thought the online was more intimate. I said, what? What do you mean? She said, well, I'm sitting in class, and what I see is the backs of a lot of people's heads. And you're up there up front. But on Zoom, I see everybody's faces. I see the tears, I see the laughter, and I feel what I'm part of. That struck me, really. I said, wow, think about that for a minute, because it turns out that's so. It turns out that's so. And if you have a chat, then all those ideas and thoughts that don't ever get expressed in class, they're expressed. And people can support one another. They can say, yeah, go for it or not. Or so it's just understand, it's a different kind of space, but it has its own strengths. It's not this kind of anonymous social media stuff. It's relational. And because it can be relational, then it can be real and it can be really powerful. So we just did a class yesterday on how to deal with loss, a 2-hour workshop, all online. We've done some work with folks in Australia online on how to coach, because our basic approach to teaching and learning is that you have to explain, you model, you practice, and you debrief. And if you're not practicing, you're not really, it's not about just the ideas, it's the practice. And we found we can do that online. You know, I went to a memorial about 2 weeks ago. The Kennedy family has had a lot of tragedy. And Maeve McKean, who was Bobby Kennedy's granddaughter, drowned in a canoe accident with her 8-year-old son. It was a terrible thing. And so the family decided to have what they call a ceremony of love and remembrance. It was all on Zoom. So me and about another 1,000 people went on Zoom. And they were speaking from it was in their family, it's their home. And it was people talking about my sister, my daughter, my wife, you know, my friend. And speaking from people's homes like that, it was like, wow, that was a pretty intimate space, you know? Now, there's no way that could have happened without the use of this tech in this way. And they were courageous to do that. I'll tell you, it's like a family operation. Nothing worked perfectly, but it was very moving. So I think we're on the threshold of learning how to use this technology in some very humanizing ways. I think up to now it's been used to dehumanize, but I think we can rehumanize it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. So for me, it's step up, claim it, and turn it to human use and purpose. And I don't have stock in Zoom.
I really like that. Yeah, I think, you know, especially from my personal experience, you know, growing up without Wi-Fi, growing up without cell phone service, you know, I really found a lot of comfort and safety almost being able to go home, not having to worry about my phone going off. And then, you know, now, so my parents still live where we lived growing up. And so same circumstances. And now like they have Wi-Fi, they kind of adapted in that sense. And now it's like, especially with the shelter in place, you know, it's like we're forced to be verbally communicative on the phone. And now it's like even they're trying to get into Zoom, like, oh, we want to see you guys. We want to do all these things. You know? And so it's just like, yeah, let me show you how to do it. And just like how much of a sight for sore eyes it could be to just see someone, like, sure, you can't give them a hug, but you could see their emotions, their facial expressions, and, you know, have good conversation. So I think it's one of the ways that we could adapt to make sure that we still have those relationships in place.
Exactly.
That's what I think is worth embracing, you know, especially with their kids as well, working with, you know, some pretty at-risk kids and making sure that they're okay. And, you know, really makes us to like, well, now I better like message them on Instagram, you know, just being creative, using their comfortable platforms and making sure that they know that even in a global pandemic, you know, we're here for them and still gonna.
That's right. No, that's spot on. That's right on, Charlie. I think, you know, we've been working with some folks in South Africa who've been teaching public narrative on WhatsApp. because the broadband doesn't support Zoom, and so they depend on mobile phones. But they're able to do enough with the texting and the images and the voice stuff on WhatsApp that they've been teaching. And this is teaching in tribal areas in South Africa in this way. So I think, yeah, it's our challenge to take this tech and use it. Techs are just tools. It's human beings that, hammers don't build houses, carpenters build houses. And so we have these tools, we need to use them and use them in good ways. That's very interesting about your folks. And yeah, that's cool. It's very cool.
Oh yeah, it's pretty funny whenever I tell that to people. They're like, wait, what? There's somewhere in California without cell phone service? Like, that's crazy. And that's just how rural the place that I come from. But I also wanted to go back to the conversation just before this question. And it was just kind of just a comment as far as like how you're talking about, it's slipping my mind, but I just remember thinking like, yeah, that's another way we could tie it to, our relationship with our culture, and as far as like making sure that, oh man, it's slipping my mind, but it's something really good and I wanted to revisit it, but
it'll come back. Yeah, it's just maybe it's gotta marinate a little bit. It'll come back. Yeah.
So what were you saying, Virgil?
Oh, I was saying, I know that, did you just have till 4:45? I see that it's 4:50.
Oh,
Dr. Ganz?
who, me?
Yeah.
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, no, I'm good. Yeah. Wait, we lost you. You went mute.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I guess it's kind of to switch a little bit, but it's more just based on my own curiosity. But maybe you've already said it. But I'm wondering, like, what have you found in some of the great leaders that you've worked with? Whether it's Cesar Chavez or Fred Ross, or maybe observing the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King. What was it about them, or Dolores Huerta? Like, what do you think it was about them that they were able to have such an impact?
Well, I think first of all, none of them ever tried to do it alone. None of them was a one-person show. And unfortunately, history sort of lifts up certain heroes and says, oh, this, it was never like that. Dr. King, I don't know if you saw the movie Selma, it was great because it showed the debate going on. I mean, Caesar worked always with other people. It was not like some just magic person. And so I think first is that they get that they can't do it alone, that you have to work with other people if you're going to actually make a difference, especially when it comes to movements or politics or any of this sort of thing. Maybe you can work alone as a scientist, but I don't think even in that you can. That's number one. I think the second is paying attention, being present to the people around you, being present to yourself, being present to what's there. And it's not like trying to go somewhere else. And it's like, yeah, but it's a deep presence that allows you to, I don't know how to put this exactly. It allows you to see the connections to what's much broader and much bigger. It's not by running away from it, it's by digging deep into relationships, into connections. Third thing is, I think, love for the work. Unfortunately, often people in movements put love for themselves or family on the side. I think that's a mistake. I think that's a real problem. But love for the work, meaning that you really care about the details. When it's sort of like, great music composer doesn't like, oh yeah, I don't need to learn that scales or any of that. I'm just going to compose great music. Well, and there's people who say, well, no, I don't detail. I'm an idea person. I said, well, you just take your idea right out the door down the road because we don't need it because it's not grounded in reality. The love for detail, and by that I mean really paying attention. It's like Beethoven pays attention to every note. I had an organizer. This was in the days we kept track of of people on 3x5 cards. This was, back in the Stone Age. And she would always lose them. And I was saying, how come you keep losing these 3x5 cards? She said, well, I don't know. I said, that's not a card. Each of those cards, that's a person. What you're doing is losing people. Oh, I never thought of it that way. See, that's kind of love for the craft, love for the details. And so that you get good at it, that it's not just something, hey, no problem. You get good at it, you work at it. And I guess the other thing I'd say is that in some way, form or not, there's a kind of sense of hopefulness and not just hurt. Anger by itself doesn't get it. It can just take you down and turn into despair. With hope, it can be powerful and it can drive you to courage. But it's hope and it's love, it's solidarity with others, and it's that sense of oneself. And I think that because you're constantly having to deal with challenges and stuff. And, sometimes I think the people that shout the loudest are the people that feel least secure. And power doesn't need to shout, power just can act. And that we get with each other. So those are some of the things. I mean, and a genuine humility. You sort of think, oh, this guy, no, you got to keep things in perspective, and recognize that your stance needs to be one of gratitude, not one of pride. So look, I'm describing maybe the perfect person because nobody's perfect. And every one of the people I mentioned has flaws, every single one of them, sometimes big flaws. But when you ask the question, those are some of the things I think, and never thinking that you know it, that you've got it all figured out. You are always learning. If you're not always learning, then get out of the deal, because life has changed and you have to just learn. And it's been a blessing to work with people mentors that I had in the South, in Mississippi, Hollis Watkins, E.W. Steptoe, working with people like Caesar, from whom to learn that the real stuff, the real stuff. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that was helpful. And well, I had two questions, but I guess I'll go with this one just to follow up, because in like research around like what makes an effective psychotherapist or psychologist, increasingly they in the past they say, oh, it's the theories or it's the interventions, but over the last 10, 20 years, they're saying it's the therapist is really important. And then if you unpack what they mean by the therapist, it's like the health, the self-awareness, the care of the therapist that really shape or promotes positive changes in the therapeutic relationship.
Exactly.
And so like, the importance of self-reflection, honesty with yourself, and ongoing sort of change, ongoing adaptation to who you are to really be a healthy, balanced person. And so like among those leaders and people that, that you come across with that you are able to garner influence or get influence over others, how much of that do you see that importance of like being in balance, of like, not having the ego, not doing it for self, speaking of, the president, but for your own sort of self-interest, like, and so if that's true of what I'm saying, then what is it about these people or people that you've come across how have they been able to develop that being humble? For me, I've gained from therapy some, but also just putting myself in a bunch of different situations, I think too, but I still got a lot to learn. But that's sort of your thoughts about that process.
Yeah, I think it's and when we think about leadership development, this is something that we really focus on a lot. You don't develop leadership by going off and having a seminar. It's how you structure the day-to-day work in which people are both challenged and supported in learning, in owning what they're expected to do, and discovering new resources within them. And that can be structured in a campaign, in an organization, or not. You can treat people like just objects and you just push them around. and there's no development there. But if you think developmentally, you can design tasks, work, so forth that does that. In terms of where these folks learned, I think it's, it's always a combination. There's almost always some teacher, like a mentor. It may have been a parent, it may have been an older brother, but there's always some teacher or teachers. And then there's the tough circumstances, because you don't learn without that. And then that's when you discover the resources to get through. And when you discover the resources to get through, which also often comes from other people, then your heart grows stronger. And I think that it's these combinations of things. I think most of the people I've met that do a lot of curiosity, really wanting to understand. It's not like, hey, I got it. It's this curious. Caesar was amazing that way. He read every book as if it were an organizing manual. I mean, it was like, what are the lessons here? How do I draw out of here something that I can use, something that's relevant to what I'm doing? So this appetite for learning and curiosity, I think, is another just sort of key element. But like I said, it is that coupled with real dedication to craft, because there's craft in all of this. There's craft in therapy. There's craft in environmental work. There's craft in organizing. And I think, when we care about something so much, then we need to step up and try to master it, whether it's playing the piano or whatever the hell it is, because that does real honor to it, is to respect it enough that we really take learning to do it well seriously. So it's both. It's not just like I have a good heart. I also need skilled hands, and I need a smart head. And that's the stuff we learn.
And Marshall, what would you say the craft that you've tried to master? Is it the organizing or teaching? What is it, the craft in your own life that you've you think narrowed in on in the sense of mastery?
No, it's a great question. I think that, I got into it through organizing, because what excited me about organizing in Mississippi was that it was a way to work with people to support the development of their own agency, their own capacity to change the world around them. So it wasn't like just working with individuals. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to do policy. It was power. It was building organization that could do that. Now, what was always really interesting to me was the whole question of development. And so with the farm workers organizing, there was a lot of leadership development. That's kind of teaching. It's teaching, not like standing up in the front of a classroom and giving a lecture. It's enabling people to learn. It's a little different. It's like creating experiences through which people learn, and then equipping people with the concepts that they need and the skills they need. So when I came back to school, at first I was focused on doing research, but when the Kennedy School asked me to do a class on organizing, it was a place I could connect my life experience with the social science I was learning in teaching, in a pedagogy with a rising generation. And it was like, wow, I get to go to class twice a week and have a conversation with the future. That is pretty cool. And it's pretty cool for them and for me, because we're all learning from it. And so I think I've come to think of myself more and more as a teacher in that sense, not or an educator, maybe. My mom was a teacher. She taught California public schools, Bakersfield, Fresno, and in LA. But she always said that education, the word comes from Latin educare, which means to draw out, not to put in. And the educator is a developer. The educator is one who empowers. Now that, I think, is a lot what I've been doing. And sometimes it takes you a while to figure out kind of what you've been doing. But it all sort of comes together for me in that. And in those three questions I quoted at the beginning, I think those questions are really profound if you really reflect on them and think what they're really about. And yeah.
Side note or side question, because when I think teaching in one of maybe the greatest institutions around teaching social justice and organizing, the Highland Center with Miles Horton,
Yep.
And others, were you part of that or visit or ever go there?
I was there once. There were a bunch of us who were in civil rights work in SNCC and so forth. And we were trying to figure out how to move forward. And we were thinking about we needed economic organizing. So we tried to get some unions to come and talk to us about what it might look like to organize in the South and do that. Only 2 unions came. I mean, anyway, that's another story. But that was at Highlander, and it was the packing house workers union, the electrical workers, and that was at Highlander. But Miles' teaching, has been really profound. And there's a guy, John Gaventa, who took over Highlander more later, who I've worked with quite a bit, who's written one of the best books about power. He really writes well about power. But yeah, see, Highlander was so cool because it was adult learning, it was leadership development, it was movement building, and we need places like that. And we don't have enough of those places. We got a lot of consultants, and we got a lot of very expensive, leadership programs that corporations spend. But places like Highlander, we need those kinds of places. Yeah.
I guess one last follow up to that. How come you think we don't have places like Highlander or, even with like the Black Panthers and the some of the programming, the community free lunches and the educational programs like since the 70s, or how come you think that, or would you consider like Black Lives Matter and some of the organizing they've done around that to be equal, or like what's your understanding of why we don't have places if there's such a need?
I think that it's a big question, and part of it has to do with the fact that for the last 40 years we've been trying to measure everything in terms of price. In other words, everything, unless it adds up to financial measure, then it doesn't count. And so when you run a society that way, you get what we're seeing right now. You get all those inequalities, you get all that suffering, you get essential workers paid crap. That's what you get, because the only way you're measuring value is dollars and cents. Now, see, we need to rebuild institutions. Strong unions, they asserted value. Religious organizations asserted value. Educational institutions asserted value, government asserted value. But so much of that has gotten colonized by this whole market stuff that it takes away. And I think if there's a blessing to the evil that we're experiencing right now, it could be to wake us up and realize how we've really lost both the institutions and the understanding that we need to create a human society, a human world. So I think this is a really crucial moment right now, because I think what your question is spot on. I mean, I had colleagues, for example, that were interested in how organizations work, right? So you want to go, where are you going to go do your research or teach? Business school, all right? So then what are you going to teach and learn about? Well, you're going to learn about corporations. Now, wait, what about community organizing? What about all the rest of that? Well, that sort of becomes a stepchild. And that's what we got to bring back, I think.
So would you say part of it is then sort of to blame on Reagan and the sort of neoliberal ideology, where everything becomes sort of market driven and a commodity?
I think it takes 2 to tango. I think that on the one hand, I think the 70s were a really important time when we really, government got turned into the problem. Everything got valued in price. I think that began before Reagan, but I think Reagan sort of was the culmination of that when he became president, began to treat government as a problem. Now, I think that the problem was that the other side wasn't fighting, not really. If you think about the Democratic Party got sort of, well, gee, they had the Wall Street group too, And so, you need, if you have one strong story, like that story the Reagan people have been telling for years, what's the other story? It's been weak and it needs to be strong. And I think that's up to all of us, because you can't defeat something by saying, I'm not that. You have to say what you are. And we've had presidential candidates that couldn't do that. Obama did that better than many. I think when it came to governing, there were some real challenges, but certainly Hillary could never do that. I'm worried about the current, nominee, but Trump is such deep evil, it's just like, but no, I think that's where we have to do a lot more work, is like, no, this is wrong. Instead of like, yeah, well, really, let's have a partnership with business and they're really on our side. Well, not so much, not so much. If you're in business to make a profit, God bless you, fine. But don't pretend that you're doing something else. If you're trying to fight for justice, you're not going to fight for justice by making a profit. It does not work that way. And so our system needs tension. It needs conflict. It needs tension to be healthy. I don't know. That's just a few reflections on this. And I know we're talking a little abstractly, but
Yeah,
I think that's
that
kind
makes
of
sense.
time we're in here.
Yeah.
And I think the kind of work you're doing is really, really important, because it doesn't come from nowhere. This stuff grows out of realities and of people. But we have to have the courage and the loudness to speak and be heard and organize.
And it seems like too, maybe with what you mentioned of Obama, was telling the right story and being able to get deep in the meeting the story of the community and where they're at, or the people, and your own story. Is that kind of what you meant by Obama
Well,
did it well?
yeah, I mean, he got that the country was desperate for some hopeful counter to Bush and to all that had been going on, and that there was a real need to find values that could connect us rather than divide us. And that was very inspiring in that campaign. The problem when he began to govern was that some of the same old came around. And so the hope and the promise wasn't fulfilled from my perspective. And because I think you've got to follow it all the way through. And what happens often with politicians is they get elected, we say, oh, that's cool. And then guess what? They've got to take care of this donor or that donor. So unless we're organized to hold them to what they say, we should not be surprised when all the other pressures move them in another direction. And if you sort of look through American history, social change has been accomplished when movements have been able to hold politicians accountable. And there's a great book called When Movements Anchor Parties by a colleague, Dan Schlossman, where he shows historically, the labor movement then held the Democratic Party accountable. The evangelical churches held Reagan accountable. So it's not always on one side, but so it's understanding the importance of politics, having influence in politics, but not being owned by it, because you've got to be able to make claims on it and keep making claims on it, I think. And that's where we have just a lot of organizing work to do,
Thank you. I see it's about a little after 5, so maybe we could have some closing words. I don't know if Charlie, you had any comments or one last question, or Marshall, if you had anything else you wanted to add. I'll turn it over to Charlie.
Yeah, that my brain blast came back to me, and
Good.
yeah, and it was kind of along the lines of just kind of finding that shared kind of experience, or that shared like issue. And it reminds me of kind of getting back to like our ceremonial dynamics. There's, like I said, a pretty dense presence of Native peoples here. We're on Wiyot land right here in Arcata, and Yurok people up there at the mouth of the Klamath. And then you got the Hoopa off the Trinity within the Klamath River Basin, and the Kuduk people in the mid Klamath watershed. Anyhow, those three tribes that I mentioned, the Yurok, Kupa, and Kuduk people are like considered sister tribes where they have like similar and shared ceremonies. And, you know, you kind of find that common ground, whether there's, you know, you always put your differences aside for the sake of ceremony and come into that space with good heart and good intention. And it kind of speaks to that. And then more recently, kind of in a more political realm, you got the dam removal on the Klamath River, which I'm sure you've heard about somewhere along the lines. And, you know, through the course of that kind of difference, you know, they kind of put farmers against fishermen, and, you know, farmers versus tribes and stuff like that. And so it got really dirty to the point where, you know, there's a 2002 fish kill, and that was pretty devastating to the tribal communities that kind of depend on that and view them as like a more than relative relationship. And so it's really like a slap in the face, to say the least. And so that was just one of the things that kind of disrupted. And now we're in a point where, you know, there's a Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement where like the farmers are kind of teaming up with tribes and kind of trying to find an agreement to make sure that the dams come out and we hold the government accountable. And that is kind of where we're at today, is the dams are planned to come out, and they're kind of going through the removal processes. And so I just really wanted to give you that food for thought, and also kind of bring it back to that local way of interpreting, you know, what you're talking about as far as the framework and the power that has with community organization. You know, there's always something that there's in common, and if we all have the same kind of need, whether that's water or whatever, you know, it's definitely worth putting those differences aside, even as hard as it could be sometimes, and to ultimately get what we all need, you know. So
yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
no, thanks for that, Charlie. I think that, yeah, exactly. And it's funny. I think when you go deep enough, you find the commonalities. It's not abstract, it's going deep. And that's where you find the common humanity. That's where you find the need for life and living. But it becomes real in the way that you're describing. And it's not easy, you know, and it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of relationship building and just a lot of courage, I think. But no, I appreciate your sharing that.
for sure. So are we wrapping it up, Virgil, you think?
I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. We will post this.
I have one thing to share. It's a song that I'm not going to sing because in the 4th grade I was told, please just mouth the words. And so that was the end of my singing career. But this was a song that Judy Collins recorded during the Civil Rights Movement. And it uses the word freedom. See, the Civil Rights Movement never called itself the Civil Rights Movement. It called itself the Freedom Movement, because freedom is a much, much bigger word than legal rights. It's about dignity, it's about solidarity, it's about strength. And so hear the word that way. And the song goes, freedom doesn't come like a bird on the wing, doesn't fall down like the summer rain. Freedom is a hard-won thing. You have to work for it. You have to fight for it, day and night for it. And every generation has to win it again. Pass it on to your children, brother. Pass it on to your children, sister. They have to work for it. They have to fight for it day and night for it. And every generation has to win it again. Pass it on to your children. Pass it on. Thank you for a chance to pass some of it on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. So with that, I don't have much more to say. Thank you for tuning in. This will be posted on our YouTube channel. And Charlie, we will have Dr. Tria Blue Wakba tomorrow, and the great environmental activist Dallas Goldtooth on Friday. So thank you, Dr. Ganz and Charlie. Any last words?
Nope. I just want to thank you, Dr. Marshall Ganz, again for sharing this time with us and your wisdom, and I really appreciate that. And so also for the audience, you know, I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow and the next day. We're going to finish this week strong. I know it's been a long week, but education and learning is always nonstop, just like Dr. Marshall again said. So with that being said, Two Feathers out.
Thank you. And great to meet you both.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
Yeah, cool. Good. Well, I hope we can do more in the future together.
Yes, I'll follow up with an email, because that would be great to do one of those public narrative workshops.
Yeah, I think it could be really exciting. I think it'd be a really exciting thing to do. Yeah, but Charlie, you escaped. You didn't get to do your story. So that's for next time.
All right. That sounds good.
All right.
Charlie will be having his first child in like 3 weeks.
Oh, man. Well, congratulations. That's wonderful. Do you know what kind it is, or is it going to be a surprise?
Surprise. Yeah, we've waited. We got
Cool.
4 more weeks. And so we're sticking to it.